I actually did a seminar at one point. I brought someone that I knew pretty well up as a demonstration. I went and I tested this person's like range of motion. I don't want to say like muscle testing, but for simplicity's sake, well, muscle testing. Everything like looks really good, right? I then went, and this was really hard for me to do because I really liked this person. He's a good friend of ours. I said a bunch of really mean things. For me to say some of the things that I did to Ransom was like, oh, I was like, oh, this just feels gross. I said a bunch of mean things to him, and I retested him. And once you know everything was locked down, I basically took this really strong guy's leg from a position of abduction. And I like flipped my finger and it was right in. So basically, neurological coordination was dramatically decreased. And then I went back and I said what I really think about him. I said, Ransom, you're one of my favorite people ever. You carry so much joy with you. Your girls are so lucky to have you, and we're so blessed to have you in our lives. You've made my life better in so many ways. I retested him, and everything came back.
This video is for educational entertainment purposes only.
How do you personally, as someone who deals with injuries, injury prevention, how do you like to conceptualize and think about pain? And do you think that the way you think about pain is maybe different depending on the population you're addressing and how you would conceptualize it?
Speaking to people who specifically are kind of in that more advanced, like, most people get on Instagram and you got a 20-something being like, oh, just pony up and like train through it. Well, if you've been in pain and there's a high cost to that pain, maybe you can't pick up your kid. Maybe you're a guy, you go to help your wife with the groceries and you can't. And you're kind of like, wow, that zings me right in the heart. Like, no guy wants to experience that, right? Like, yeah, wife, thanks for getting the groceries because I can't do it. There's a different meaning behind that. And I typically, when I'm talking with people who hurt, the very first thing that we need to talk about is why is this important? That sounds really surface level, and I think a lot of people are going to hear that, kind of gloss over it. But at the end of the day, our life is for living. And if we're not addressing what's keeping us from living and why it's important, all the science in the world doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think is often the most burdensome part of pain? Is it the actual physical experience of the pain, or is it more this kind of psychological weight where you can't do things? And the sort of, I also find like there's an anxiety that people often associate with pain, where like you do something that hurts, and then you're like, oh God, is this going to hurt again?
It's like, for some reason, I think a lot of us feel like as soon as we start to feel pain, we feel like somehow that's like shifted us into this proof of like, okay, well, now it's all downhill. And really often for those of us who have felt it, there's a fear of losing a part of our identity. And that fear, when for most of us, like we don't ever feel like we've really made it anyway. As soon as we start to feel that fear of pain and there's this loss and this lack, there's a big shift in the belief system. And that belief system is a big part of what actually dictates how our brain perceives what we can and cannot do. So we get this cycle going of like maybe we feel pain as a result of like something we believe, which I could get into later. And that shifts our belief system further. And the biggest thing here is that the way that we feel about ourselves, no one talks to us more than we talk to ourselves. And so as soon as we start to feel a certain way about ourselves, it changes how we show up. And when we show up a certain way, our brain is really smart and subconsciously picks up on these things, and it will shift that internal narrative further. So one of the things that I look at when I'm working with someone in pain is like, okay, there's obviously a belief system thing here. And I work strictly in the remote realm right now where communication is largely asynchronous. And so you can imagine that trying to get to the root of like, okay, what are the belief systems involved in this? Beyond just like, I think any great clinician is going to sit here. It's like, oh yeah, pain at least has, a belief system component. I think there's more to it than that. I think it has a lot to do with fear of losing a part of us, a fear that maybe we are going to shift into a direction where we are losing ability somewhere. And what does that mean for us? I think there's a part of us that as human beings, we are hardwired to want and to need connection somehow, on our physicality of how much we can actually participate in things. I mean, like we were just talking about this, I think before we were on air, is like, you were sick of the holidays and you had to kind of like almost disengage a little bit, right? How we engage physically is a big part of how we experience life with the people around us. And when we're looking for connection, most of us want to feel like our life is meaningful. We want to feel like we're part of something, like we matter. When we have to disengage, I think that's one of the biggest things that keeps us from feeling like we actually matter. And pain, I think, sparks that feeling of I'm disengaged or need to be put away from this thing that's important to me. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of like, it's like my heart in a in a
Oh
sense.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think that pain sort of makes you feel small. That actually happens kind of in a physical way, right? If you are anticipating pain, you might brace yourself, you might actually make yourself smaller. And I think that is part of what happens on a sort of instinctual level. And then that manifests in your behaviors too, right? You avoid things, as you said. You have to protect yourself. And that sucks, right? Like that just like fundamentally sucks.
To go through life playing scared.
Yeah, totally.
They're playing small. And that's really what that does.
If someone comes to you and they're in pain, what are like kind of basic questions you might ask? Maybe diagnostic questions, or again, you framed
Yeah.
this sort of in a narrative sense. So I'm wondering if that's more of your approach.
Yeah, so with what I do now, I want to make it really clear that like I'm not the traditional like I'll back up a little bit. So I worked in a clinic for a long time. I actually started working in a PT clinic when I was 15. Like my mom had to like drive me to work after soccer practice kind of thing. I worked in a PT clinic all through college. Obviously went to PT school, like went to grad school, did that for a bit. Worked in a clinic after. I don't do that anymore.
Right.
Like what I do now is so different. And I pretty much only work with people, not only, but almost only online. And it's a really different sense because typically the people who found me kind of fall into a little bit of a different psychographic where training is number one, super important to them. And they found that people locally, like for whatever reason, they are unable to help them get better, right? Or to fully appreciate how important training is to them. So like I've got a couple of people that I've spoken with over the last year that have been like, yeah, I went to a clinic and they didn't know what to do with me. They were like afraid to touch me in their little polo shirt, pocket protector, and khaki pants. And I was like, yeah. So generally when someone comes to me, I try to really fine line because I want to talk about pain only as much as it allows that person to know they are heard, to know that they're seen, to know that they're acknowledged. But then the last thing I want to do is overtalk it. So I'll be honest, a lot of times I kind of wonder or worry a little bit that I'm like not talking about pain with people enough. But the reality is that it's not so much the pain, it's what it means. So I actually just made a lesson for some of my clients on like how to talk to me about pain because especially asynchronously, it's like if someone says like, hey, this happened or like this hurt, we have a couple of options of how we respond to that, right? A reactive person is going to say, oh my gosh, we have to fix that right now. Someone who says, okay, well, like this happened, but it's more important to me to be able to train and I can kind of ignore it. Those are two very different states. And they really extend, like, there's a continuum, right? We could say that those are close to, maybe not the end range, but like close to the end range of the continuum, and everyone is going to fall somewhere in between. So my first order of operations is to figure out where is this person on that. They don't care if they hurt. They just want to be able to do what they want to do versus fix it mentality. Because those are really different states, right? I've been like, I'll be honest. As long as I know that whatever I'm doing isn't necessarily hurting me in the long run, I'm like, I don't really care if I hurt if I can do what I want to do. And this is something that I experienced when I was training really, really hard. I've since been pulled out of that with some health issues. But to me, it was like I could handle a little bit of back pain. I could handle if my back felt stiff, achy, 6 out of 10 the rest of the day if it meant I could go and pull 405 for 12 reps. That was more important to me. However, there are a lot of people where it's kind of the opposite. They're like, man, I don't care if I can do that. It's really important to me if I go to pick up my kid that she doesn't see me wince when I get off the
Mm.
ground. And so a lot of this has to do with meaning, identity, obviously what's important to the person, right? And so when it comes to like talking to someone about pain, I only talk about it in as much as it's important to them. The more we talk about something, we give power to it. The last thing I want to do is give power to the pain.
First off, just wanted to say I'm sorry you've been experiencing health issues,
Oh,
but
it's been such a blessing in so many ways. Like it has been so good for me as a coach to, it's been so good for me as a big nerd, as a coach. It's been hard in a lot of other ways, but thank you.
interesting. Okay, well maybe we'll circle back to that. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
totally can.
But just to comment, especially what you said about focusing too much on pain, that makes me think of one of the things you're taught if you've ever worked with kids, right? Is that if a kid falls, you're not supposed to be like, "Oh gosh, buddy, are you okay?" Right? You don't frame it that way. You're like, "Hey, buddy, you're fine," right? Like you may even not ask the question. You may not bring up the possibility that they could have experienced something negative, because then they're going to adapt that frame. And I think that just because it happens to kids doesn't mean it doesn't happen to adults. It's the same thing. And I like the contrast, right, between, the sort of hyper aggressive athlete, which I think I would certainly fall into. I'm definitely someone who would much rather do the thing and be in pain rather than not do the thing. But Do you find that adopting those kinds of behaviors, that sort of grinning and bearing it, does that actually lead to worse outcomes in the long run, right? Like, are we suffering longer? Are we getting more injured? Or is there some kind of built-in resiliency there that perhaps counterweights that?
I mean, I'll be really honest, that is such a broad umbrella question, and there's so many ways to talk about that, right? Because, like, okay, let's put this under the lens of tissue tolerance. At some point, thinking about tissue tolerance is okay, well, what kind of tissue? We're talking tendon, are we talking muscle? Are we talking soft tissues? Are we talking active structures? Are we talking passive structures? What are we talking about? Right? So we have to look at that lens. We also need to look at the lens of like, okay, what are the neurological adaptations that are happening within the brain? There's a lot of stuff going on up here that kind of associates basically the idea of like neurotags of these experiences don't occur independently. They occur very, very much interwoven with things like our vestibular system, things like our thoughts, our belief system, the people with us. I mean, there's just, it's never just like in isolation, right? And so I think that, the question of like, okay, at what point, I think the question is, at what point does just getting through it become detrimental? Is that kind of what you were asking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, 100%, 100%. And again, I realize it's still a very broad question.
Yeah, I think some of this really just comes down to what's important to this. This is going to be, I'm going to be so repetitive today. I hope I don't listen back to this and go, God, Dani, you literally just like repeated yourself over and over.
Well, sometimes things are worth repeating though, right?
I think a lot of this really is, dependent on structure, it's dependent on tissue, it's dependent on goals, things like that. I could think of a couple different cases that I'm working with right now where, and actually, I'll just talk about my husband. I work with him. I basically give him ways to keep training really hard, even though he has the boo boos. Now, at a certain point, how many times are you circumnavigating the boo boos, and when are you going to basically run out of rooms, right? Or run out of room? Basically, like if we inherently have like 20 levers we could pull to get someone to continue to train, eventually you're going to run out of levers, right? Well, maybe, unless you get really creative.
Mhm.
I think there are systems that we can use to basically give each lever more leverage and create space between when we need to pull levers, if that makes sense. So, maybe someone starts to feel shoulder pain and they make some training adjustments, right? And they make these adjustments over 6 months, and then they're out of levers to pull. And then it's like, okay, well, now we really got to go back to the drawing board. My whole method of working with people who want to be able to train hard, have a little bit of an injury history, and also like don't want to let that win. My whole system is basically designed to create a favorable economy of exchange so that we can create as much space between when we need to pull these levers and figure out how to pull back as possible. Now, obviously, there's a lot that hinges upon. It hinges upon biomechanics, it hinges upon neurotone, it hinges upon autonomics, it hinges upon the local biochemistry. I mean, there are a lot of components that go into how and when do they pull these levers. I will say that for myself, I let things get way far towards this end of the spectrum, and with some of my health issues, they were very much exacerbated by um, a lack of desire to pull back. That kind of interwove autonomics with biomechanics, and that drove up some of the sensitivity of some autoimmune issues that I had underlying. Now, ultimately, the autoimmune issues are a stopgap for me. But had I not had all these other things happen, would the autoimmune have expressed itself quite so severely? Probably not. And so I think that's, where things get a little bit messy as we think about pain and we think strictly like tissue, biomechanics, the really obvious things, right? And I think in that way, we tend to get a little bit overly reductionist in terms of like, what are we actually after here? Does that make sense? Like, are we after like being able to train? Are we after full life? Are we after pain mitigation? What's the end goal?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah,
I hope so, because I just rambled a little
no,
bit.
no, no, no. I'm tracking. I'm tracking totally. Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind. I like the point you made, right, about sort of, I'm simplifying, but essentially like stacking stressors and that exacerbating underlying conditions, right? That's something that happened with you. It's interesting because that can just manifest in so many different ways. And I think that people underestimate how interconnected all of our bodily systems are. And so when you're pressing a lever in one place, you don't actually know that it may be triggering something in another place.
I tell people all the time that a great coach is going to be someone who explains things so simply to you, you don't know how many levers they're pulling. You have no idea how many different systems they're actually trying to intentionally affect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'll give you just, this has been very top of mind for me, and I think you might find it interesting. It's slightly left of what we're talking about. I'm a lifelong musician, and I've always been like a pretty mediocre singer. Like my best moments have been okay, but it's something I like that really mattered to me. And a couple years ago, I experienced some health issues, and I was kind of back to back to back. And what happened was I picked up some compensatory mechanisms in my singing, and it started to sort of knock out kind of like the systems I had built in place, right? So my systems were never perfect. Again, the analogy I'm thinking of is your kind of autoimmune state. Had I been someone with flawless technique, a flawless immune system, I wouldn't have needed the little patchwork structure I built, but then I had that structure and then it started to fall apart. A couple months ago, I like literally couldn't sing a note because I had just like broken too many little things without realizing that that's what I was doing. And like, luckily, actually, very recently, I seem to have like figured this out. And that actually is kind of going to lead me to my question, is it in this moment for me, again, this is a singing thing, this isn't lifting, but I really did make relatively quick progress with pretty, I would say, targeted adjustments, right? I went from being non-functional one week to being totally functional the next. And I do find that with things like movement patterns, you see that all the time, right? Like someone can have crippling pain for a year and you can make one adjustment
One
in a
simple
week and they'll be fine, right? So can you just talk about that a little bit and help me to understand, like, how can the body be so responsive after being so stuck for so long?
I've been referencing this idea a lot lately, but I actually did a seminar at one point. I had Justin Harris and my husband and myself down at Hidden Gym here in Allen, Texas, and I brought someone that I knew pretty well up as a demonstration. And so we started this podcast with me basically saying that like no one talks to us as much as we talk to ourselves, right? I went and I tested this person's like range of motion. I don't want to say like muscle testing, but for lack of a better word, we'll just for simplicity's sake, well, muscle testing. Everything like looks really good, right? I then went, and this was really hard for me to do because I really liked this person. He's a good friend of ours. He actually just turned pro this year, so really cool. I said a bunch of really mean things. Like, no, like it was like I in general, I tend to like one of my gifts is like I'm really good at encouraging people. I'm really good at calling out the good in someone. It's something that just comes really easily to me. I'm good at verbalizing it. For me to say some of the things that I did to Ransom was like, oh, like I was like, oh, this just feels gross. I said a bunch of mean things to him, and I retested him. And once you know everything was locked down, I basically took this really strong guy's leg from a position of abduction. And I like flipped my finger and it moved right in. So basically, neurological coordination was dramatically decreased. And then I went back and I said what I really think about him. I said, Vincent, you're one of my favorite people ever. You carry so much joy with you. Your girls are so lucky to have you, and we're so blessed to have you in our lives. You've made my life better in so many ways. I retested him, and everything came back. So I took this poor guy for like an emotional level.
Like awful, yeah.
And then after that, he went to go train. So I bring up that demonstration because, of course, like, don't get me wrong, like, I put a lot of pride in what I do, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time looking at biomechanics. I spent a lot of time getting really good at assessment and then taking the assessment and making it really good online. Like, that's a whole different skill set. Like, I've really poured myself into getting great at what I do because there's this entire population of people who, quite frankly, in-person PTs they're just missing the boat on. Like, I can't send my husband to a PT down the street. Are you kidding me? They're gonna have no idea what to do with him. He's enormous. Like, good luck.
You're right, he's like 300 pounds, right?
Oh yeah, he's 300 pounds with a full set of abs. Like,
Yeah. Not a human being by normal people's standards.
No, I mean he's basically a rhinoceros.
Yeah. I mean, it's very cool. It's very cool. Yeah.
He's super sweet. He'd be a great podcast guest for you as well. He's incredibly well spoken, very articulate. Anyway, like so I poured myself into getting really good at what I do. And I look at it now, and after doing this for as many years as I have, the assessment's really important. But if I can change someone that quickly with how I speak to them, what's the bigger lever here? Now, granted, that's not always the case, right? Like, am I saying that everyone just needs to like talk to themselves more kindly and if things are going to get better, like fix your mental state, everything's going to get better? No, because our interests contribute to our mental state, right? So there's not like up and down, ascending, descending. Like, that's a back and forth. But I will say that the assessments provide a lot of clarity, they provide a lot of context. And I think that one of the biggest problems right now, at least in our space, is that you've got a bunch of people who are, maybe like 25, 30, they haven't really like carried on the injuries, trying to really dominate the space of here's the problem, here's how you fix it. You just need to do X, Y, and Z. And what I see over and over and over again, especially for people who want to train hard, for people who are 40 or over, or have like, 20 years of training behind them, maybe you're 30 or 35, but you've been training hard for 2 decades, your nervous system's in an entirely different state. All the same rules a 25-year-old over here is talking about, those principles from a first principles approach are true, but they need to be applied to a system very differently. Very, very differently. It's just like, inherently we know that if you take someone who struggles with hypermobility, you're going to treat them differently than you would treat, a really toned up bodybuilder. Do they have the same like scientific principles that are probably going to apply? Well, yes, but they're different systems, so we need to apply them differently. And what's happening is that because fitness and generally like hard training has become so popular over the last 2 decades, we're seeing more people of this, but we haven't developed the systems that are really going to work with them. And it makes me sad because these are the people who should feel awesome in life. I mean, like when Dave, this big hulking man with this commanding presence, comes up to me and his wife and just says, "I think you're amazing." How much impact does that have? So you get these guys, these big gargantuan guys that have potential for enormous impact, unable to utilize that because there's something in them that's making them play small. I can't be okay with that. There's so much impact on just like people that happens from these high, anyway. Hi, sorry, I care a lot about what I do. I hope that like makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
AJ here. If you're enjoying this interview, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it makes a huge difference. And if you're looking to transform your body and your mind without jeopardizing your health, consider hiring me as a coach. Links in the video description. Appreciate you.
It's interesting the point you made about the nervous systems of advanced athletes or people who've been in the game for a long time. I mentioned I had just been sick. It was a sinus infection. It was a pretty normal infection as far as infections go. But after I started to recover, I went back to the gym and I did what I normally do, which is like, you try to take things easy, you sort of scale things back. And I felt absolutely awful. It was like I had been scared, right? Is the analogy I gave to people, right? It was as if someone had just run up behind me and spooked me. I felt like my pulse was racing, felt sort of background anxiety. And that had never really happened to me before after prior sicknesses. But I am like way stronger than I used to be, right? Like my nervous system is much more tuned. I can get way more out of my body than I used to be able to do. And as a result, like I have to handle this thing in different ways. And I was still treating it like I could just sort of put my keys in the ignition and go. And that is no longer a thing I can do. But the advantage is like I can drive faster, right? If we're going to keep the analogy. When I get going, I can go way faster and more powerful, but it takes way more thought and effort.
Got the right pit crew, even if you're driving fast, as long as that pit crew can change the tires quickly and do what they got to do quickly, you're going to be good to go.
That leads me to my question. Is that when we're talking about, you work with people, obviously, when we're talking about high level athletes, as someone sort of scales in ability, is it still possible for them to kind of succeed on their own? I know that not everyone needs you necessarily, right? But are they going to need greater community support, whether it's with a partner, a lifting crew, etc.?
I think that probably depends on the individual and how they're hardwired. Now, I'll speak from my experience. I think a lot of people have, and it's very common to talk about like external validation versus the process. And I can talk a little bit about my own story. For me, bodybuilding was something that I so badly wish I could go back and be where I was. I'm never going to be able to be that competitive again. I'm never going to get on the Olympia stage again. I don't even know that I'll get on pro stage again, honestly. But for me, it became a way where I was trying really hard to earn companionship and earn, my way into. I'll speak openly about it because Dave loves training so much, and with where our marriage was at the time, I felt like in order to earn his companionship, I had to train really hard. And so rather than it being a connection point, it became a pressure point.
Yeah.
After the Olympia in 2023 and 2024, my health issues really hit the fan. I was already having seizures like twice a week for the last 6 to 8 weeks of Olympia prep. Yeah, and I trained through it. So like the whole like, oh, it's like suck it up. I'm out there like, yes. um, but in 2024, when I had to basically take a bunch of time off training, I started to have some other issues. And even when I did try to get back into the gym, not only was I scared of losing the companionship, right? So there's that fear component. But when I would try to earn it back by going to the gym, it's like my body knew like this place was associated with hurting myself and with danger. And I can't believe we're going to talk about this on here. I'd start to have panic attacks just driving the parking lot of the gym. And I think that's really important to talk about because for some reason people are so ashamed to feel like they're anxious going to the gym. But for so many of us, when it feels like there's a point of connection, and at the same time, we're like, there's an element of like shame around, I don't want to do this right now. Am I going to lose my connection with these people? I don't feel I can do this right now. Am I going to lose my worthiness? I don't think I can do this right now. Is my ability to be, physical or like be strong or show up a certain way, does that disqualify me from something? And so we end up in this roundabout, like how many people do work with it? They're like, I want to train, but I just don't. And so they go to the gym, they sit in their car, they freak out a minute, and then they just drive home. We've all done that, right? And maybe this is something I didn't need to talk about more because what that came down to for me was like, number one, I had been really, really almost like I gaslit myself into thinking that like I had to train in order to like be good enough to show up and qualify myself elsewhere in life. But that caused a lot of disconnection from, I'm going to call the seizures pain because it's more analogous to what other people feel, pain, and what I perceived. And so we get this like schism that happens, and we continue to at times kind of betray what our body really needs in order to pursue this sense of belonging. I know this is getting like way deeper on the psychological level, but I think for a lot of people, we're afraid to go, I don't want to do this today. Does that mean that I'm not part of the club? I don't want to train today. I don't want to push to failure. My body's not asking for that. Is there something wrong with me? And especially as training hard has become so in vogue, I think it's really, really important that we as coaches have our antennas up to kind of be able to pick up on like when these things may need to shift. Like we might need to coach someone differently, and rather than saying, I want you to take the week off, say, I want you to observe how you're actually feeling non-judgmentally. Like when you pull up to the gym, if you're feeling anxious, like observe it, don't judge it. Kind of just take note of that because that's going to prevent a lot of issues from popping up. There's nothing worse than having mental anxiety and physical pain and a sense of like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this, then what? This is my social circle. That is disconnection. And I think that is a big fear that people have.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. I think the phrase you said in particular that really stuck in my mind was that you want to train, right? And I think that that's something that most people experience at some point with something, maybe not with training. I've had it in relationships that were collapsing, romantic relationships. I've been like, oh God, I want to be with this person. I
Yeah.
want to fix this, but you don't want it, right? Like that's what that means. It's you actually don't want this thing, and maybe you're trying to override that. Maybe you're judging yourself. Maybe you're imagining an invisible party that's judging this interaction, and you're trying to use that as a sense of authority to move you forward. And it's a tough thing because particularly the example you gave, right? Obviously, lifting was important to you. And there were clear benefits to lifting and trying. But because of the story you had been telling yourself, the things you'd been saying in your head, it became this like really costly, caustic, expensive thing for you that had a lot of high stakes. It sounds like part of you recognized like, hey, I benefit from this. This is good for me. But also part of you was like, fuck that. Like I can't, like I don't want this. I don't know. It's not. I don't have a shiny ending to this rant, but I think that those are real, legitimate questions. And the point you made is that I think the way you solve it is by listening to yourself, by actually stopping and listening. Because if you keep pushing in either direction, right? If you just force yourself, eventually you'll break. But I think also if you just succumb to the pain as well, you will break too.
there's a lot of popularity right now around like, okay, discipline over motivation. Okay, great. There's also like the idea of mastering your own thoughts. Okay, great. But all of those things impose judgment. And as soon as we sense judgment, again, like that's why the part of us that's like, there's literally like structures in our brain that are like, oh, judgment basically assumes there's a good way and a bad way to do things, and we are wired to want to do the good. Um, I think that's where there's a lot of power, just kind of stepping back and like not even having to say like I don't want to do the thing, but just like observing like, quick. Here's how I feel when I do it. Is that important? Is that something I want? Yes, no. But yeah, it's. I mean, it's messy. I don't. I'm not. I don't think we are ever going to have how to balance doing the things that we don't necessarily want to do with like still having the discipline and not over disciplining. I mean, gosh, if anyone knows how to like really walk that line perfectly, man, I hope they're up on a stage talking somewhere because I want to sit in on that talk. I think the best thing that we can do is practice, right? Like the best thing we can do is practice, just stepping back. And for me, I fought tooth and nail for like a good chunk of 24 and the first half of 25. I kept saying, if I just go, I'm going to get it back. Well, I needed to have a surgery last minute in November. And I ended up taking, 8 weeks off training. And now in January, I'm like, oh, I actually do want to train again. If I had just done that in 2024, how much of my time would I have gotten back? But I was so convinced that if I just did the hard thing, just do the hard thing over and over. Coming from the girl who literally ceased twice a week for the last 8 weeks of Olympia prep so that she could get on the stage, I don't think I lacked for like being able to do the hard things, right? And I think a lot of people are in that stage. And so we started all of this talking about pain, and I don't know. I think people are so quick to make a judgment about what pain means. And I think a lot of people that I work with are often kind of struck by the level of like the first thing that I do, these like big dudes, right? And all of a sudden they're like sharing, they're sharing things you wouldn't expect. I'm one of the only females that I know that like I coach men. Um, and the thing that I hear repeatedly is that there's a space of compassion. And I don't think we as a generation have been taught how to be compassionate with ourselves. And I think especially, post 2020, where everything we did was kind of put us in a camp of belonging or not belonging, I don't know that we know how to actually approach ourselves with compassion. And I don't mean to go like, super woo here, because again, like I work with men who come to me and they're like, hey, I used to be able to deadlift 800 pounds. Now I can't bend over and like pick up my kid. I want to train. Can you fix my knee? And I'm like, I mean, yeah, I can. Can we talk about
yeah, how did we get here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's core, and I don't know if this is cultural or biological or sociological, but it's hard to acknowledge that you're in pain and to feel powerful at the same time.
Bingo. You
Right?
nailed that.
So we just do everything we can to avoid that. I mean, the constant question I have, or I hear people say in various forms, is essentially like, am I in pain or am I a pussy? Right? It's some version of that. Is this real? Can I just suck it up? Can I be David Goggins and run on bleeding feet? And I think that like that's just the wrong way to approach it. It's just the wrong question. You can feel your feelings and not have judgment, and then use that as data to determine what your intervention should be.
I think that like on a very biological level too. So we live in a really interesting time where at any other point in human history, if someone had pain, would it be such a huge like, oh my God, am I a pansy or should I just do something else? At no other point in time, like, right? So we live in this age where we're constantly comparing and judging ourselves against people who like biologically are different. So again, I'll use myself and Dave as examples. We grew up in very different environments. My nervous system is literally like, they talk about autoimmune stuff kind of coming from, different upbringings, things like that. And my training basically became, if I don't train like Dave, I'm failing. Well, his nervous system is entirely different. His structure is very different. So I've gone a little bit down this rabbit hole of like, okay, well, why do certain people respond to different training stimuli different? Why is he really good at deadlift and I can never make my hinge look like his? On a very like simplistic biomechanic level, right? I've got clients who come to me and they're like, my deadlift just feels bad. I'm like, well, your pelvis is shaped in a way where you're not going to be able to hinge really well. You can't change that. Does that mean you shouldn't deadlift? No. It just means maybe you shouldn't beat yourself up if it doesn't look like someone whose pelvis is literally structured for a hinge, right? But we get this narrative going on social media that tells us, again, from people who are like generally either these like the 1% where their nervous system is hardwired to hurt and just numb itself and do okay with that, or someone who's maybe structurally put together where this is how you have to train, and that becomes that becomes the standard, and anything less than the standard becomes not good enough. And so I don't know, I think pain becomes a bigger deal to people right now because they think it signifies something about themselves of being like not good enough, rather than their body saying, hey, this doesn't feel great. So there's that like moral dilemma. Does that make sense?
Hmm. I mean, I think a lot of what fitness culture seems to revolve around is the denial of imperfection. Essentially, they're like, anybody can do anything. Anyone can do anything, either through a combination of will, effort, training, or drugs. Right.
Right.
Like I can overcome any genetic proclivity. It doesn't matter. Everyone should be able to deadlift to 800 pounds. And if you can't, it's because you're failing.
And you're just not trying hard enough.
You're just not trying enough, or your risk tolerance is too low, and you need to up your stack. Whatever your version of that is. I'm built like a penguin. When I walk, I'm sort of like flat-footed and look like this. My deadlifts have always been ugly. My hips aren't right. It's okay, but that's how I'm built. What are you going to do?
There's so much in there. First off, I want to say the penguin walk again.
My girlfriend and I are trying to do salsa dancing. I don't know if have you ever tried salsa before?
Once. It's not for me, but it's really, really cool.
It's really cool. I think most dancing, particularly salsa, you're like supposed to be on the balls of your toes.
Right.
And I'm learning the absolute basics of salsa, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how to do this at all. Like, this is just not where my center of gravity is, right? Like, I don't know how to spin. Apparently you're supposed to do that on your toes. I just sort of like go on my heels like a Michael J. Fox and like a Back to the Future, right? Like, yeah, I don't know how to do it.
Best description that you could possibly give him. But what's so interesting too is that like, so I've someone else that I'm working with right now who he and his wife on the weekends, one of his goals when our intake forms, he was like, I want to be able to salsa dance with my wife and not be able to be in like extreme pain. I'm like, cool, you can do that. He sends me a video at one point of him salsa dancing, and I was like, bro, don't take this the wrong way. Like, this became very clear to me what we need to work on from the biomechanics standpoint. Like, this would be easy now. We have no problem here. But I think that's a great example and kind of a great segue about like when we train, there are predictable changes that happen in our body, just as like certain tone levels of specific musculature gets upregulated. And if we superimpose that on top of different structures, like if we took, Dave's really wide structure, I've got someone else, like my salsa dancing guy, has a more narrow structure. If we superimpose like high tone levels on those bodies, their ribcage and pelvis is going to shape differently, which is going to start to change what they have access to. And I think that's one of the big things that I see in people kind of with that, like, I don't want to say like the over 30, because I really think it's like the over 35 and have trained for 2 decades crowd, is that like, it's not that the solution is hard. It's just that the solution requires acknowledging that literally your structure looks different than it did 20 years ago. And if it didn't, you'd be bodybuilding really poorly.
Right. What body have you been building if your structure hasn't changed over multiple decades?
Can we wrap for a second over some of the voice box resonance stuff and singing?
Yeah, sure.
So like, I'm really curious. There's a guy on Instagram, his handle is The Musical Athlete. And he and I are trained in the same kind of formal schools of thought. But one of the things that he looks at is like voice box resonation, how it plays into what we do in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
When you were really sick, what was it, or what did it take for you to kind of get your vocal cords back? And that resonance.
Okay. Yeah. Do you mind? I'll use specific language. Yeah. So let me know what makes sense and what doesn't. Okay. In classical singing, like in operatic singing, part of the reason why they have such a large resonant voice is because they lower their larynx typically. It's not super depressed. It's not like Rocky. It's not this, but it's like a relatively below neutral larynx posture. Okay. And that encourages open throat resonance, and it ultimately leads to more power and volume. There's other ways to get power in your voice. So when I went get, right, that's not lowering my larynx. Yeah, that's epiglot. I don't know how to say this word. Epiglottical. It's your epiglottis constricting, and so you get twang. Is often the term used in vocal pedagogy. So I say that because what happened when I started to get sick was ultimately it led to this pattern where I was relying too much on lowering my larynx, and I didn't have. There are ways you can do that, right? Like opera singers do that. I didn't have the right musculature to do that, and so essentially, like I was using a heavier weighted sound to do things that should have been lighter and more pingy. And because I was doing that, then I started to physically compensate in other ways. And so I actually started to crane my neck forward because
Yeah.
this was a way to short circuit that tension. But then when that started to not work, because again, as you said before, right, like when the levers start to break, then I tried to widen my mouth, but that actually exacerbates the tongue tension.
Yeah.
Yes. So ultimately, like all I really needed to do was stop lowering my larynx, which then made this much easier. Instead of going wide with my mouth, you actually want to go long and try to not, and you can still move your neck. There's nothing wrong with moving your neck, but having it jutted and locked is going to shorten everything and tighten everything. But it took, yes, I think I fixed it in a week, but it took me like 3 years. Right, because for one time I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't understand it. And what I actually had to do was I had to exaggerate the things I was doing that were wrong so that I could realize, oh yeah, this doesn't work. And then that was enough to give me permission to stop doing it. Does that make
I,
sense?
oh, 1000%. I'm
Yeah.
sitting here laughing, like chuckling, like eating all this up because the whole idea of like basically opening and closing everything with the larynx and the airway, that is like there were a lot of reasons I asked that question. And now I'm like just geeking out. You can see my brain just doing this. Um, Combined with what you had mentioned about like it was like a week, but it was really like 3 years. That model, everything about that is analogous, I think, to how we can bring this back to the question of okay, like how do we figure out when to pull the levers in training?
Hmm.
Because you basically earned your 1 week solution with the 3 years of data collection, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the other cool thing about this is not only does that from a mental model standpoint work, and I was so glad to hear that. The other component is that what you just mentioned with basically the ability to create or constrict space. That's 1000% what a lot of people really struggle with. And so what happens is what you experience here with that change in the ability to allow flow and tension on top of that is a big part of why people who are a little bit more advanced in their lifting have issues that they do. Is there's been an
Hmm.
upregulation of tension in certain joints, in certain muscles, I should say, and that changes how the whole system sits. So when you were talking about the next stuff, I'm like, one of the big, like one of my big KPIs with leg training right now is like I know it was a good leg session, I'm gonna be sore. If I walk out of the session and I'm not straining my voice. If I'm straining my voice, or Dave is like, yeah, you're like yelling, it seems like you're hoarse and you have to try to get like your voice out. That's when I know that instead of getting good internal pressure management, I've relied on all this to stabilize me.
Hmm.
No, it's funny. We pick up on these little KPIs, but it's just really fun hearing like about the larynx dropping and like oh super cool. You should totally go check out the musical athlete. He's brilliant. He talks a lot about how our ability to even ground through our feet and produce internal rotation forces. The feet is going to help us produce force through our vocal cords and things of that nature. It's fascinating. This whole body is just so interconnected. But
No, it's super cool. It's super cool. Yeah. Yeah, and definitely I certainly find that if I over like even this has always been true for decades. If I stress myself too much with a lifting session, of course my singing suffers. And I think that actually kind of strikes me as almost inevitable, especially if I'm talking about like truly singing excellently. Like that is a high demand activity, and I just think like you can only do so many things super well in like a 4 hour time period. Like I don't know, Pavarotti didn't bench press 315 and then like step on stage that night, right?
right. Well, I think that you're hitting on another concept that I use with people a lot, and something you said earlier would maybe think about this too, with the assumption like, oh, anyone can do anything without recognizing the cost. And so
Yeah.
I think that what you're bringing up here is kind of this what I look at as like my series of exchanges or like the economy that someone's body lives in, right? You can bench press 315, but the cost is that you won't be able to have the same airway flow because of a lot of restriction that you would need to in order to have Pavarotti do Pavarotti things. And really, I think that for a lot of us, when we do have, I'm going to hate that bringing it back to pain because I don't really talk about pain all that much, but when we do have pain, a lot of times it comes down to the fact that we have chosen a series of exchanges in our internal economy that has biased one area of performance in a way that doesn't work for some of the others. We've created that economy. Now we can make some decisions to shift that the other way. You could, I don't know, like if you can maintain really good vocal position the rest of the day at 255, you can do that, right?
Mhm.
And over
Right.
time, like, are you going to be able to gauge whether or not you can maintain good vocal position afterwards, after you take 275? Yeah. Is there a way to do that? Yes, but it relies on a lot of other
Mhm.
subsystems that I think people are so dogmatic about progressive overload that they forget how many other things have to occur at that exact same moment. And all the subsystems have to be brought up to par. We've gotten so linear in our thinking, and I understand that, like, cool, we want to be evidence-based, and like, cool, we want to, base everything on first principles and things like that. But I think we've restricted so much of how we actually go about providing people freedom with their sessions and freedom in their lives because we've kind of tracked everything into this linear thinking that, number one, is just super reductionist, and number two, honestly, it puts fences on people. As soon as we put a fence on someone, it changes the state of their nervous system. And we change the state of their nervous system, just like my friend Ranson at that seminar, he's going to move differently.
No, that makes perfect sense. In vocal pedagogy, one of the phrases people use is they talk about a coordination. So the way you sing a thing is a type of vocal coordination.
Sure.
You could also use the word mode, but I think coordination has better carryover to athletic discussions. If we're talking about someone in the gym, you mentioned like the necessity to have freedom. I am certain, based on what I know about you, you don't think there's such a thing as perfect form, right? I don't think that exists. Do you think it makes sense to conceptualize having different coordinations? Like if depending on my outcome, depending on what costs I'm willing to pay, depending on my current nervous system state, might I approach the same movement in different ways, all of which could be valid and successful?
Absolutely. And I think having that coordinated variability is actually a really, really important property. No two reps, even if they are, let's say hypothetically you did have a perfect, right? No two reps are going to be exactly the same. And the extent to which someone can deviate from their like perfect form and still be like, okay, I would call that coordinated variability. You can get to the bottom of the squat lots of different ways, right? You're going to move through the concentric lots of different ways. There's a lot of value in that. I think that's a big pillar for resiliency. And I think as much as we want to talk about perfect form, being able to say like, hey, actually I'm good when I'm not, that displays a resilience that, do we want to have to rely on that? No. But is it a nice to have? I think, yeah, it is.
Do you think that for something like, let's say, like a one rep max effort, is it likely that there's less coordinative variability there? And then right, like you might have to do that more perfectly because you're nearer to the edge of your abilities?
Probably. I think I'm trying to make a case for no, because part of what I do is I like to poke holes in things.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm sure you do too, right? I
yeah,
get
yeah,
that sense. You're like, oh, what
yeah.
about? Um, I think the traditional answer would be yes, but how many like messy one rep maxes do we see
Right.
people shift out of
Right.
position and that's when they get through their sticking point, right? So I think that's where again, like we're gonna superimpose like, okay, well, was this movement even something that like for me, I'm not a good like my hips are not put together to hinge well. Okay, cool. Do I love to deadlift? Absolutely. So deadlift is not a great movement for me. If I lose perfect form, is that a bad thing? Maybe, maybe not. And that's
Hmm.
way overly reductionist from like what my
Hmm.
brain is
Yeah,
really doing.
yeah.
But I think a lot of it comes down to like, okay, was that actually a good movement for someone's structure anyway? And if you really want to go down the structural bias rabbit hole, Bill Hartman's put out a lot of really good information. It's a little bit hard to follow at times, but the basic premise here is that all movement is going to it occurs on a rotational plane, and in fact, people this drives me nuts. People think about sliding filament theory, and for whatever reason, that makes us think that we only operate linearly. But when we actually look at the muscular structure, we know that the actin myosin heads actually operate on a helical nature.
Hmm.
So when we go and we say we're doing, sagittal plane. We're not
That doesn't mean anything.
all
Yeah.
occurring on a helical kind of three-dimensional plane anyway. Um, but what he's brought up is that, okay, well, we know that that's true. Then do we not want to start to appreciate that, like, the structure of someone's internal pressurization? So, like, think rib cage pelvis. Do we not want to acknowledge that maybe some people are just going to be better at certain movements than others? And at face value, we know that. I think Bill gets a lot of resistance from people because he thinks about it at such a deep level that it requires people to kind of undo a lot of their fixed thoughts and the biases that they have. And I'll be honest, I can't go too far down his rabbit hole because I'm like, okay, that's too much for me. I'm a nerd.
Mm.
But I do think it's worth kind of getting into. There are just some things that your body's not going to be great at. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. No. But when it comes to movement or coordinated variability and having some change between reps, is that a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on the movement for that person's structure.
Hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense.
I hope so, because again,
Mhm.
to me that was a little gobbledygook, but
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I'm remembering almost a year ago. I think I had a conversation with Andy Triani, and we talked about yeah, who's
brilliant.
awesome. Who I'm sure you yeah. We one of the things we talked about was a similar topic in that he was arguing that deadlifts have more inherent variability than a bench press. They require less precision and you can succeed in that movement in more ways. And he said at the sort of the farther end of that spectrum would be something like a golf swing because he works with golfers. And so he thought of that as a movement that requires more precision. I'm
Yeah,
not saying he's wrong or right about any of these things. I think the point that you made is probably the most salient for people is just that yes, there may be some things individuals are worse at or better at. That doesn't mean you can't do them or you shouldn't do them, but it probably means that you need to be open to the fact that you're going to do it in a way that may not look like somebody else. I feel like
yeah.
that's the most practical takeaway.
How about we just stop even. We need to get off the playing field of being told what we can and cannot do from someone who hasn't earned that right. And that compared again, like I hate to continue to harp on the comparison, but for whatever reason, because fitness has become so in vogue and fitness culture has become so big, it's such an area and an avenue where people start to get these ideas about themselves based on their what they can and cannot do or should not do. And for some reason we let that carry over the rest of life. And that does change how we show up. And I hate that because if there's so much positive, tremendous impact that we can have on one another. Man, like I want as if the world is a prism, I want as many colors out there as possible.
Dang, I think that's a good note to end on. This is awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was so fun to talk with you, especially about like the vocal resonance stuff. Man, I can geek out over that for forever.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I mean, it's been literally like I solved it like a week and a half ago. So it's been like very top of mind for me. So
But I'm
it's fun to
really
talk to you.
curious, has your training improved since then? In terms of
But
like, has your training improved since then?
that's you mean in the gym, right? Right. You don't mean vocal training. Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting thought. I think that that's so funny. It absolutely has, but I didn't associate the things at all together.
I would guess that has more to do with internal force pressure management and the ability to ground yourself and internally rotate and get onto the ground. Um, IR is required for force development, and it's also required one of the hardest things for us to recapture when we don't manage pressure well. So they're very related.
The point you made earlier about how a good coach can sort of explain something complex without showing you all the levers. I'm not accusing me of being a good coach or my brain of being a good coach, but what you said there, the way I've conceptualized my behavior in the last week or so in the gym is I've more like given myself the permission to just be more deliberate with my movements. That's what it's felt like I've been doing. But I think what you said is actually probably more accurate on like a physiological level, right? But what it felt like in my brain was I was like, no, you know what? Instead of acting like this is a chore that I need to get through, I'm gonna like inhabit the moment more. And it's felt very easy to do in the past week or two.
Well, it's interesting that part of why that can happen is our nervous system state, even dorsal vagal versus ventral vagal state, is going to influence neural tone levels. And obviously there's a voice box component to that as well. But as we change tone levels, we're going to have access to greater ranges of motion in our training, which generally is going to make it easier to train well too. So you see, there's like a lot of relationship between these things. It's just cool. It's just cool. The body is fascinating.
Well, it's so cool to me because, you brought up evidence-based fitness, right? Like there's all this talk all the time about how quote unquote close you need to train to failure, et cetera, all this. And it's like, but there's so many factors that influence performance, right? How can you define failure if you're ignoring all of the, like your nervous system activity, your psychology, your mood? Like if I show up at the gym on barbiturates, failure is going to look very different, right? Right? Yeah, right. If you're seizing, right, failure is very different.
On a
Yeah.
really practical level, something I work on with like literally, I would say 9 out of 10 guys that come to me, they'll come to me like, yeah, like I've gotten really strong, been training 20 years, beat the log, but like, brrr, they do all that, but they don't realize the small concessions they've made over time to get there. And so they're not really getting true muscular failure. They think they are, but the muscle is failing because something else has failed first. And if we're not addressing this, we're really actually hampering true muscle growth. So, good way to think about this. Hack squat's a great example. Past a certain point, you're not going to have good internal pressure management because you're getting a lot of top-down pressure. If you can't expand against that, that system's going to cave. That's going to change how well you can actually allocate tension onto your quads. So let's say maybe you've got, 6 plates on there, you take it for a set of 10, but those last 4 are really just this happening and your back taking it out of the bottom and you're, getting like the shrug going on and it's not really in your legs anymore anyway.
Right.
Your ability to manage that internal pressure, that's your freaking stopgap, not your quads.
Right. Not your muscles. Yeah. Not the muscles
Right.
you're targeting. Yeah.
So, that sounds really simple to say, right? But when we get into the gym, it's like we get that hack squat loaded up, we're like, want to get after it. And we kind of like, baby goes out of the bathwater, and all of a sudden we're like, wow, that was not my quad at all, but my low back sure is cranky. I mean, just on a really practical level, like evidence-based, progressive overload, all these things, like they occur within a hierarchy. All of those things are happening at the same time. One system changing is going to change 25 others. So to sit here and say, to have the pride and the arrogance to say that we're controlling all of these, I'm sorry. When did you figure out everything there is to know about the human body? And I gently challenge you on that. That's what bothers me, is it reduces creation to this. We're put together so incredibly, so complexly. And to sit there and try to reduce it down to one thing simply because we won't borrow from other areas. Like, how many people have actually thought about the fact that muscle structure is not actually linear? It's not. Okay, and then on top of that, well, we have this white stuff, this fascia that's actually highly afferent and goes to the brain. Okay, well, if I tell everything this red stuff to be really tense all the time, what afferent does that send into the brain? Is that maybe going to prohibit growth and the expansion of the neuron to get a nice 3D, bubbly, round look? All the people that I work with are going to colloquially laugh at me for this because this is what I call the sausage lesson. We want that sausage to bust out of the
Of the casing, yeah.
or after.
Yeah.
And it just, oh man, I don't know how we got on this topic, but that was a good little riff.
Wow. I mean, you brought up earlier, you mentioned just polarization, right? One of my personal theories is that we've essentially built a world that's so complex that we can't deal with it. We can't, it's too much information. And so we just break things down into the simplest chunks that we can handle. And one of the consequences of that is just a massive reduction in nuance. Because it's just too hard. Like it's just too hard, right? I don't want to go to the gym and think about like the actual structural composition of my muscles, right? Like I just want to do a hack squat.
What do you mean?
Yeah, like what do you, like that's nuts.
Think about that
Right?
three-dimensional nature.
Yeah, right. Imagining the helix within, like I don't want to do that.
Prior to today, when was the last time you used the word helix? Probably been a couple of years.
Yeah, probably a couple of years.
But I think the cool thing about this is that like so obviously when I work with people, I look for simplicity. My whole, well, not always, often. My goal is like, if I can solve a really complex problem in a really simple way and they don't even know I'm doing it. Now, obviously when I'm first getting going with someone, I'm like, okay, I'm really sorry. You're going to drink through a fire hose for like a month. After that, we'll make it really simple. But like generally when people go in and they move how they want to move, that's kind of what they needed anyway. Like as soon as we stop changing the way we move because we saw something on social media. Funny story. So I tore my adductor longus tendon back in 2017. And as a PT, I was, at the time, there was one powerlifter in the women's 123-pound class who was stronger than me. One. Of course, I measured myself against her. There's Stefi Cohen. She was also a PT, right?
Oh, it was Stefi Cohen?
Yeah, this is back in 16.
Right. I'm sorry, I forget how fucking strong you were also too. So
yeah, I used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to be really, man, like talk about like I know how to do hard things. Why did I feel like I had to continue to prove that to myself? Why don't I just like stop a minute? Yeah, I was really strong. There was one other person, and I said, you know what? I need to squat exactly like she does. At the time, I was not thinking about her hip structure, her rib cage structure, her pressure management strategies. I also didn't know at the time I had a connective tissue disorder that basically shredded my tendons. So the one time I tried to squat like someone else, I tore my adductor.
Yeah.
And that set me back. It set me down a really, really cool coaching like rabbit hole in terms of like it was the catalyst for figuring out everything about my practice and my coaching model right now. So I'm so grateful it happened. But it was also the one time that instead of moving the way that I knew I was best at moving, I was like, you know what? This person does it this way. I'm going to do it that way. Definitely broke myself in the process, literally.
Yeah.
And we do the same, like we do the same thing every day on so many different levels. We need to stop that. Like I'm not saying that we all are like I'm not going to go all like Kung Fu Panda, like where he opens the scroll and is like, you are the secret ingredient or secret ingredient soup. But I mean, a lot of times I think when we trust ourselves, there's a lot to be said for like, when I do a lateral raise this way, I do feel more dealt. Maybe I should just do it that way instead of like, like it's different. And I think that's where things like movement, or I'm sorry, like dancing and vocal things, anything that get us rotating and out of this linear, rigid way of doing things is so beneficial for the brain too.
1000%. It is. I don't know. It's hard because like you learn things from imitating people, and that is valid. But then you have to stop doing that at some point. I think that is the kind of the difference between the amateur and the master, right? Like the amateur is imitating, they're figuring stuff out. The master at some point has synthesized all that and they're able to do it the way they need to do it. I mean, it sucks that you went through that, but it also sounds like that enabled you to get to mastery because you realize like, oh, I can't do it like Stefi Cohen.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think you just hit on a really good point there of we should look for self-mastery, right? And sometimes that means that like, especially like, we're in the coaching space. Obviously, we believe in coaching. And I think pedagogy and how we actually go about teaching people things is, I think, another quality of a really great coach. I think pedagogy and leadership in and of itself is a really important kind of development topic for coaches. But there's a lot to be said for telling someone, hey, when you squat this way, I want you to do it like XYZ versus like, hey, try this as you're warming up and see how it feels. There are different ways that we kind of encourage people to explore the movement and explore some of that coordinated variability of like, okay, what does actually feel good? And does that feel good at like my training level loads or just warm ups, things like that? So speech is, I think, super underrated. And as much as I am exhausted by doing looms, I think that's the reason that I do them, is that having that face-to-face contact, knowing how something is said is super important. Because if I just voice dictate things and I read through it, I'm like, man, I sound cold-hearted. Like, I am cold. But the warmth that comes through in speech and intonation allows someone to hear that with a much different state. So
if you're overly prescriptive like that, right, they can interpret it as judgment and then they can have a fear response. It just makes me think again what you were speaking about before about not wanting to want to go to the gym. If you're thinking of every time you squat, you're like, oh, shoot, if I don't do it how coach says, I'm going to be a failure. You're going to add all this emotional cost that doesn't need to be there.
I think you just hit on something that I'm probably going to take into my coaching model, which is like, what's the best way I can teach them while minimizing the cost? Because anytime that we interject our own thoughts to someone, I mean, there's weight with that, right? Like there's importance with that. And I think that there are a lot of people that came into the coaching space thinking like, oh, coaching's this really easy gig. And it's like, no. Like, our words are super important. Not only that, but we have to have the capacity to hold things for people and to hold them, but also put them down. That is a hard skill to master. And I think a great coach is going to understand the cost of not doing that, the cost of not creating a space for that, but also the cost of overemphasizing and over-owning that.
Yeah.
Not just to them, but to the client.
Yeah, I mean, if coaching just meant telling people what to do and having them do it, like I mean, I guess you'd still have to know the right things to say, but still, what a magical world.
Yeah, right? Coaching is hard. Coaching is really hard. I work harder now with fewer clients than I ever did working in a clinic seeing, you know,
Mm.
20 to 30 people per day. There was one clinic I was working at where I saw 3 to 4 people an hour. And that was hard for different reasons, but I could kind of like not put so much thought into my interactions with them, right? Coaching in the online space is there's just too many filters that things get put through. It's like you're playing a game of like, I mean, telephone for lack of a better word, and trying to anticipate and really get in that person's head without ever assuming, like, I will never assume I understand exactly how someone is feeling. Right? Like how
Mm.
arrogant of a coach would I be if someone sent me their check-in and I said, oh, well, they're feeling this way. And I just tried to attribute thoughts to them that they never said. Now I can like guess on that a little bit, right? I want to speak to them, but I want to speak to them just like I'd be speaking to someone who's actually important to me because, side note, this person's important to me. And I think that we're going to see a lot of coaches phase out because they realize how emotionally taxing it is. The human brain is literally not designed to have so many points of contact. It's designed to know, like, you're nodding, you know the number.
Yeah, 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 100%.
We're designed to literally know like 50 people. And yet, what are we exposed to daily? There's a cost with
I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that I think about is I will have busy coaching days and then I will like be less present with my girlfriend. Some of it is I think actually my social needs are relatively low too, right? So
that.
it's like, well, I've already done a bunch of this. I've had enough interaction. I don't need more.
Preach. I think the hard thing about coaching is that people outside of the coaching world, they don't realize that so much of what we do is basically we're expected to maintain however many people are on a roster. We're expected to maintain those relationships and hold it in a mostly one-sided context.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, it's not like most other relationships in that sense, right? Unless you, I mean, maybe maybe you have really shitty friends who don't care about you, and then it's
Yeah,
one-sided, right? But otherwise, no. I'm actually going to go to the gym. I'm really excited.
yeah. Go train.
Yeah.
Thanks
And
for
thank.
having me, AJ. I really appreciate it.
No, this is super fun, Danny. Really appreciate it.